Welcome to the American History from 1750 to 1776 class by the Grumpy Old Vet. This is Lesson 7 of 28. This class will cover the history, politics, and economic context of the time leading up to the colonists separating from England and daring to create a new kind of government, the greatest one of its kind. With that, let's move out. Welcome to the American History from 1750 to 1776 class, brought to you by the Hillsdale Justice Project at Liberty Hall, narrated by John Rutan, 1750 to 1763. The French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763. The period leading up to the American Revolution was marked by escalating tensions between the American colonies and Great Britain. The French and Indian War, part of a global conflict between France and Britain, ended in 1763 with Britain emerging victorious. However, the war left Britain with a massive debt, and they looked to the colonies to help pay for it. This led to a series of taxes and policies that began to anger the American colonists. 1760s, the rise of colonial grievances. In response to British attempts to extract revenue from the colonies, Parliament passed several acts that sparked resistance. The Sugar Act, 1764. This law aimed to raise revenue by taxing sugar and molasses imported into the colonies. The Stamp Act, 1765, a tax on paper goods, which led to widespread protests and the formation of the Stamp Act Congress, the first unified resistance against British policies. The Townshend Acts, 1767. These placed duties on glass, paper, paint, and tea, further angering the colonists, leading to boycotts of British goods. Colonial opposition continued to grow as Britain responded to protests by sending troops to maintain order, leading to incidents such as the Boston Massacre in 1770, where British soldiers killed 5 colonists. 1773, the Tea Act and the Boston Tea Party. In an effort to save the struggling East India Company, Britain passed the Tea Act, 1773, which gave the company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies. Colonists saw this as another form of taxation without representation. In response, on December 16, 1773, American colonists, disguised as Native Americans, boarded British ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water, the Boston Tea Party. This event led to even harsher British retaliation, including the Coercive Acts, also known as the Intolerable Acts, which closed Boston's port and restricted self-government in Massachusetts. 1774, the First Continental Congress. In response to the Intolerable Acts, the colonies convened the First Continental Congress in September 1774. Representatives from 12 colonies met in Philadelphia to discuss a united response to British policies. The Congress called for a boycott of British goods and sent a petition to King George III to restore colonial rights, but Britain refused to address the grievances. 1775, the battles of Lexington and Concord. Tensions continued to escalate, and in April 1775, British troops were sent to Concord, Massachusetts, to seize colonial weapons and arrest leaders of the colonial resistance. On April 19th, British soldiers clashed with colonial militias at Lexington and Concord. The shot heard round the world marked the beginning of the Revolutionary War. The British were forced to retreat after facing strong resistance from the colonial militias, and fighting spread throughout New England. 1776, the Lee Resolution and the Declaration of Independence. In the wake of the fighting at Lexington and Concord, colonial resistance to British rule grew stronger. The Continental Congress convened again in 1775, and by 1776, it became clear that reconciliation with Britain was no longer possible. In June 1776, Richard Henry Lee, a delegate from Virginia, proposed the Lee Resolution, which called for the colonies to declare independence from Britain. After debate, the resolution was adopted on July 2, 1776. 2 days later, on July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress formally adopted the Declaration of Independence, written primarily by Thomas Jefferson. This document proclaimed the colonies' independence and outlined their reasons for separating from Britain, including grievances over taxation without representation, the quartering of soldiers, and the dissolution of colonial governments. The declaration marked the official declaration of separation, but did not create the United States. Rather, it declared the reasons for the break with Britain to the world. However, the Lee Resolution was the moment that marked the official beginning of the United States, as it was the resolution that formally declared the colonies' independence from Britain. The declaration served as a justification for this action to the rest of the world. Thus, from 1750 to 1776, escalating political strife and British policies fueled colonial discontent, culminating in armed conflict and the eventual declaration of independence from Britain. French and Indian War, 1754-1763. The French and Indian War, from 1754 to 1763, was a theater of the 7 Years' War, which pitted the North American colonies of the British Empire against those of the French, each side being supported by various Native American tribes. At the start of the war, the French colonies had a population of roughly 60,000 settlers, compared with 2 million in the British colonies. The outnumbered French particularly depended on their native allies. 2 years into the French and Indian War, in 1756, Great Britain declared war on France, beginning the worldwide 7 Years' War. Many view the French and Indian War as being merely the American theater of this conflict. However, in the United States, the French and Indian War is viewed as a singular conflict, which was not associated with any European war. The British colonists were supported at various times by the Iroquois, Catawba, and Cherokee tribes, and the French colonists were supported by Wabanaki Confederacy member tribes Abenaki and Mi'kmaq, and the Algonquin, Lenape, Ojibwa, Ottawa, Shawnee, and Wyandot Huron tribes. Fighting took place primarily along the frontiers between New France and the British colonies, from the province of Virginia in the south to Newfoundland in the north. It began with a dispute over control of the confluence of the Allegheny River and Monongahela River, called the Forks of the Ohio, and the site of the French Fort Duquesne at the location that later became Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The dispute erupted into violence in the Battle of Jumonville Glen in May 1754, during which Virginia militiamen under the command of 22-year-old George Washington ambushed a French patrol. In 1755, 6 colonial governors met with General Edward Braddock, the newly arrived British Army commander, and planned a 4-way attack on the French. None succeeded, and the main effort by Braddock proved a disaster. He lost the Battle of the Monongahela on July 9, 1755, and died a few days later. British operations failed in the frontier areas of the province of Pennsylvania and the province of New York during 1755-57, due to a combination of poor management, internal divisions, effective Canadian scouts, French regular forces, and native warrior allies. In 1755, the British captured Fort Beausejour on the border separating Nova Scotia from Acadia, and they ordered the expulsion of the Acadians, 1755-64. Soon afterwards, orders for the deportation were given by Commander-in-Chief William Shirley without direction from Great Britain. The Acadians were expelled, both those captured in arms and those who had sworn the loyalty oath to the king. Natives likewise were driven off the land to make way for settlers from New England. The British colonial government fell in the region of Nova Scotia after several disastrous campaigns in 1757, including a failed expedition against Louisbourg and the siege of Fort William Henry. This last was followed by the natives torturing and massacring their colonial victims. William Pitt came to power and significantly increased British military resources in the colonies, at a time when France was unwilling to risk large convoys to aid the limited forces that they had in New France, preferring to concentrate their forces against Prussia and its allies, who were now engaged in the 7 Years' War in Europe. The conflict in Ohio ended in 1758 with the British-American victory in the Ohio Country. Between 1758 and 1760, the British military launched a campaign to capture French Canada. They succeeded in capturing territory in surrounding colonies and ultimately the city of Quebec in 1759. The following year, the British were victorious in the Montreal Campaign, in which the French ceded Canada in accordance with the Treaty of Paris, 1763. France also ceded its territory east of the Mississippi to Great Britain, as well as French Louisiana west of the Mississippi River to its ally Spain in compensation for Spain's loss to Britain of Spanish Florida. Spain had ceded Florida to Britain in exchange for the return of Havana, Cuba. France's colonial presence north of the Caribbean was reduced to the islands of Saint Pierre and Miquelon, confirming Great Britain's position as the dominant colonial power in Northern America. The Royal Proclamation Line of 1763. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 was issued by King George III on 7th October 1763. It followed the Treaty of Paris, 1763, which formally ended the 7 Years' War and transferred French territory in North America to Great Britain. The proclamation forbade all settlements west of a line drawn along the Appalachian Mountains, which was delineated as an Indian reserve. Exclusion from the vast region of Trans-Appalachia created discontent between Britain and colonial land speculators and potential settlers. The proclamation and access to Western lands was one of the first significant areas of dispute between Britain and the colonies, and would become a contributing factor leading to the American Revolution. The 1763 proclamation line is situated similar to the Eastern Continental Divide, extending from Georgia to the divide's northern terminus near the middle of the northern border of Pennsylvania, where it intersects the northeasterly St. Lawrence Divide and extends further through New England. British colonists and land speculators objected to the proclamation boundary since the British government had already assigned land grants to them, including the wealthy owners of the Ohio Company who protested the line to the governor of Virginia as they had plans for settling the land to grow business. Many settlements already existed beyond the proclamation line, some of which had been temporarily evacuated during Pontiac's War, and there were many already granted land claims yet to be settled. For example, George Washington and his Virginia soldiers had been granted lands past the boundary. Prominent American colonials joined with the land speculators in Britain to lobby the government to move the line further west. Pontiac's Rebellion, 1763. Pontiac's War, also known as Pontiac's Conspiracy or Pontiac's Rebellion, was launched in 1763 by a loose confederation of Native Americans dissatisfied with British rule in the Great Lakes region following the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763. Warriors from numerous American Indian nations joined in an effort to drive British soldiers and settlers out of the region. The war is named after Odawa leader Pontiac, the most prominent of many indigenous leaders in the conflict. The war began in May 1763 when Native Americans, alarmed by policies imposed by British General Jeffrey Amherst, attacked a number of British forts and settlements. 8 forts were destroyed, and hundreds of colonists were killed or captured, with many more fleeing the region. Hostilities came to an end after British Army expeditions in 1764 led to peace negotiations over the next 2 years. The natives were unable to drive away the British, but the uprising prompted the British government to modify the policies that had provoked the conflict. Warfare on the North American frontier was brutal, and the killing of prisoners, the targeting of civilians, and other atrocities were widespread. In an incident that became well known and frequently debated, British officers at Fort Pitt attempted to infect besieging Indians with blankets that had been exposed to smallpox. The ruthlessness of the conflict was a reflection of growing tensions between indigenous peoples and British colonists. The British government sought to prevent further violence by issuing the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which created a boundary between colonists and natives. The Sugar Act and Stamp, 1764-1765. During the period from 1763 to 1775, in the 12 years after the French and Indian War, and before the outbreak of the Revolutionary War, colonial distrust of Britain grew markedly, and the emerging united national identity in America became more prominent. In just over a decade, proud British subjects in the American colonies became ardent anti-British patriots struggling for independence. Britain's economy during the 1700s was based on mercantilist theories that taught that money was power. The more money a nation had in its reserves, the more powerful it was. Britain and other European powers, including France and Spain, actively sought new colonies in the Americas, Africa, and Asia to stimulate their economies and increase their wealth. Colonies provided cheap natural resources such as gold, cotton, timber, tobacco, sugarcane, and furs. These materials could be shipped back home to the mother country and converted into manufactured goods, which were resold to other countries and the colonists at high prices. Immediately following the cessation of the French and Indian War, British Prime Minister George Grenville ordered the Royal Navy to begin enforcing the old Navigation Acts. Parliament had passed a major Navigation Act in 1651 to prevent other European powers, especially the Dutch, from encroaching on British colonial territories. The act required colonists to export certain key goods, such as tobacco, only to Britain. In addition, any European goods bound for the colonies had to be taxed in Britain. Although the law had existed for over 100 years, it had never before been strictly enforced. Because the French and Indian War had left Britain with an empty pocketbook, Parliament also desperately needed to restock the treasury. Led by Grenville, Parliament levied heavier taxes on British subjects, especially the colonists. First, in 1764, Grenville's government passed the Sugar Act, which placed a tax on sugar imported from the West Indies. The Sugar Act represented a significant change in policy. Whereas previous colonial taxes had been levied to support local British officials, the tax on sugar was enacted solely to refill Parliament's empty treasury. The same year, Parliament also passed the Currency Act, which removed devalued paper currencies, many from the French and Indian War period, from circulation. In 1765, Parliament passed the Quartering Act, which required residents of some colonies to feed and house British soldiers serving in America. These acts outraged colonists, who believed the taxes and regulations were unfair. Many also questioned why the British Army needed to remain in North America when the French and Pontiac had already been defeated. Though the colonists disliked all of these acts, they particularly took offense to the 1765 Stamp Act. This tax required certain goods to bear an official stamp showing that the owner had paid his or her tax. Many of these items were paper goods, such as legal documents and licenses, newspapers, leaflets, and even playing cards. Furthermore, the act declared that those who failed to pay the tax would be punished by the Vice Admiralty courts without a trial by jury. Colonists were particularly incensed because the Stamp Act was passed in order to pay for the increased British troop presence in the colonies. Not only did the colonists feel that the troop presence was no longer necessary, they also feared that the troops were there to control them. This military presence, combined with the Vice Admiralty Courts and Quartering Act, made the Americans very suspicious of Grenville's intentions. Declaratory Act 1766. The Declaratory Act was an act of the Parliament of Great Britain, which accompanied the repeal of the Stamp Act 1765 and the changing and lessening of the Sugar Act. Parliament repealed the Stamp Act because boycotts were hurting British trade, and used the Declaration to justify the repeal and save face. The Declaration stated that the Parliament's authority was the same in America as in Britain, and asserted Parliament's authority to pass laws that were binding on the American colonies. Representatives from a number of the 13 colonies assembled as the Stamp Act Congress in response to the Stamp Act 1765 to call into question the right of a distant power to tax them without proper representation. The British Parliament was then faced with colonies who refused to comply with their act. This, combined with protests that had occurred in the colonies, and more importantly, protests which had arisen in Great Britain from manufacturers who were suffering from the colony's non-importation agreement, all led to the repeal of the Stamp Act. Normally, the economic activity in the colonies would not have caused such an outcry, but the British economy was still experiencing a post-war depression from the 7 Years' War. Another reason for repeal of the Stamp Act was the replacement of George Grenville, the Prime Minister who had enacted the Stamp Acts, by Charles Watson Wentworth, 2nd Marquess of Rockingham. Rockingham was more favorable towards the colonies, and furthermore, he was antagonistic towards policies that Grenville had enacted. Rockingham invited Benjamin Franklin to speak to Parliament about colonial policy, and he portrayed the colonists as in opposition to internal taxes, which were derived from internal colonial transactions, such as the Stamp Act called for, but not external taxes, which were duties laid on imported commodities. Parliament then agreed to repeal the Stamp Act on the condition that the Declaratory Act was passed. On March 18, 1766, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act and passed the Declaratory Act. The Declaratory Act proclaimed that Parliament hath and of right ought to have full power and authority to make laws and statutes of sufficient force and validity to bind the colonies and people of America, in all cases whatsoever. The phrasing of the act was intentionally unambiguous. In other words, the Declaratory Act of 1766 asserted that Parliament had the absolute power to make laws and changes to the colonial government, in all cases whatsoever, even though the colonists were not represented in the Parliament. Although many in Parliament felt that taxes were implied in this clause, other members of Parliament, and many of the colonists, who were busy celebrating what they saw as their political victory, did not. Other colonists, however, were outraged because the Declaratory Act hinted that more acts would be coming. This Declaratory Act was copied almost word for word from the Irish Declaratory Act, an act which had placed Ireland in a position of bondage to the Crown, implying that the same fate would come to the 13 colonies. Townshend Acts 1767-1768. The Townshend Acts, or Townshend Duties, were a series of British Acts of Parliament passed during 1767 and 1768, introducing a series of taxes and regulations to fund administration of the British colonies in America. They are named after the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who proposed the program. Historians vary slightly as to which acts they include under the heading Townshend Acts, but 5 are often listed. The New York Restraining Act of 1767 passed on the 5th of June, 1767. The Revenue Act of 1767 passed on the 26th of June, 1767. The Indemnity Act of 1767 passed on the 29th of June, 1767. The Commissioners of Customs Act of 1767 passed on the 29th of June, 1767. And the Vice Admiralty Court Act of 1768 passed on the 6th of July, 1768. The purposes of the acts were to 1. Raise revenue in the colonies to pay the salaries of governors and judges so that they would remain loyal to Great Britain. 2. Create more effective means of enforcing compliance with trade regulations. 3. Punish the province of New York for failing to comply with the 1765 Quartering Act. 4. Establish the precedent that the British Parliament had the right to tax the colonies. The Townshend Acts met stiff resistance in the colonies, and public opposition to them was widely debated in colonial newspapers. Opponents of the acts gradually became violent, leading to the Boston Massacre of 1770. The acts placed an indirect tax on glass, lead, paints, paper, and tea, all of which had to be imported from Britain. This form of revenue generation was Townshend's response to the failure of the Stamp Act 1765, which had provided the first form of direct taxation placed upon the colonies. However, the import duties proved to be similarly controversial. Colonial indignation over the acts was expressed in John Dickinson's letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania and in the Massachusetts Circular Letter. There was widespread protest, and American port cities refused to import British goods, so Parliament began to partially repeal the Townshend duties. In March 1770, most of the taxes from the Townshend Acts were repealed by Parliament under Frederick Lord North. However, the import duty on tea was retained, in order to demonstrate to the colonists that Parliament held the sovereign authority to tax its colonies, in accordance with the Declaratory Act 1766. The British government continued to tax the American colonies without providing representation in Parliament. American resentment, corrupt British officials, and abusive enforcement spurred colonial attacks on British ships, including the burning of the Gaspee in 1772. The Townshend Act's taxation of imported tea was enforced once again by the Tea Act 1773, and this led to the Boston Tea Party in 1773, in which Bostonians destroyed a large shipment of taxed tea. Parliament responded with severe punishments in the Intolerable Acts 1774. The 13 colonies drilled their militia units, and war finally erupted in Lexington and Concord in April 1775, launching the American Revolution. Boston Massacre 1770. The Boston Massacre, known in Great Britain as the Incident on King Street, was a confrontation in Boston on March 5, 1770, in which a group of 9 British soldiers shot 5 people out of a crowd of 300 or 400 who were harassing them verbally and throwing various projectiles. The event was heavily publicized as a massacre by leading patriots such as Paul Revere and Samuel Adams. British troops had been stationed in the province of Massachusetts Bay since 1768 in order to support Crown-appointed officials and to enforce unpopular parliamentary legislation. On the evening of March 5th, Private Hugh White stood on guard duty outside the Boston Custom House on King Street, today known as State Street. A wigmaker's apprentice, approximately 13 years old, named Edward Garrick, called out to Captain Lieutenant John Goldfinch, accusing him of refusing to pay a bill due to Garrick's master. Goldfinch had settled the account the previous day and ignored the insult. Private White called out to Garrick that he should be more respectful of the officer, and the 2 men exchanged insults. Garrick then started poking Goldfinch in the chest with his finger. White left his post, challenged the boy, and struck him on the side of the head with his musket. Garrick cried out in pain, and his companion Bartholomew Broaders began to argue with White, which attracted a larger crowd. Henry Knox was a 19-year-old bookseller, who later served as a general in the Revolution. He came upon the scene and warned White that if he fired, he must die for it. As the evening progressed, the crowd around Private White grew larger and more boisterous. Church bells were rung, which usually signified a fire, bringing more people out. More than 50 Bostonians pressed around White, led by a mixed-race former slave named Crispus Attucks, throwing objects at the sentry and challenging him to fire his weapon. White had taken up a somewhat safer position on the steps of the Custom House, and he sought assistance. Runners alerted Captain Thomas Preston, the officer of the watch at the nearby barracks. According to his report, Preston dispatched a non-commissioned officer and 6 privates from the Grenadier Company of the 29th Regiment on foot to relieve White with fixed bayonets. The soldiers were Corporal William Wems and Privates Hugh Montgomery, John Carroll, William Macaulay, William Warren, and Matthew Kilroy, accompanied by Preston. They pushed their way through the crowd. Henry Knox took Preston by the coat and told him, "For God's sake, take care of your men. If they fire, you must die." Captain Preston responded, "I am aware of it." When they reached Private White on the Custom House stairs, the soldiers loaded their muskets and arrayed themselves in a semicircular formation. Preston shouted at the crowd, estimated between 300 and 400, to disperse. The crowd continued to press around the soldiers, taunting them by yelling, "Fire!" by spitting at them, and by throwing snowballs and other small objects. Innkeeper Richard Palms was carrying a cudgel, and he came up to Preston and asked if the soldiers' weapons were loaded. Preston assured him that they were, but that they would not fire unless he ordered it. He later stated in his deposition that he was unlikely to do so, since he was standing in front of them. A thrown object then struck Private Montgomery, knocking him down and causing him to drop his musket. He recovered his weapon and angrily shouted, "Damn you, fire!" then discharged it into the crowd, although no command was given. Palms swung his cudgel first at Montgomery, hitting his arm, and then at Preston. He narrowly missed Preston's head, striking him on the arm instead. There was a pause of uncertain length. Eyewitness estimates ranged from several seconds to 2 minutes, after which the soldiers fired into the crowd. It was not a disciplined volley, since Preston gave no orders to fire. The soldiers fired a ragged series of shots which hit 11 men. 3 Americans died instantly: ropemaker Samuel Gray, mariner James Caldwell, and Crispus Attucks. Samuel Maverick, a 17-year-old apprentice Ivory Turner, was struck by a ricocheting musket ball at the back of the crowd and died early the next morning. Irish immigrant Patrick Carr was shot in the abdomen, an inevitably fatal wound at that time, and died 2 weeks later. Apprentice Christopher Monk was seriously wounded. He was crippled and died in 1780, purportedly due to the injuries that he had sustained in the attack a decade earlier. The crowd moved away from the immediate area of the custom house, but continued to grow in nearby streets. Captain Preston immediately called out most of the 29th Regiment, which adopted defensive positions in front of the State House. Acting Governor Thomas Hutchinson was summoned to the scene and was forced by the movement of the crowd into the council chamber of the State House. From its balcony, he was able to minimally restore order, promising that there would be a fair inquiry into the shootings if the crowd dispersed. Committees of Correspondence, 1772. The Committees of Correspondence were, prior to the outbreak of the American Revolutionary War, a collection of American political organizations that sought to coordinate opposition to British Parliament and later support for American independence. The brainchild of Samuel Adams, a patriot from Boston, the committee sought to establish, through the writing of letters, an underground network of communication among patriot leaders in the 13 colonies. The committees were instrumental in setting up the First Continental Congress, which met in Philadelphia. The function of the committees was to alert the residents of a given colony of the actions taken by the British Crown, and to disseminate information from cities to the countryside. The news was typically spread via handwritten letters or printed pamphlets, which would be carried by couriers on horseback or aboard ships. The committees were responsible for ensuring that this news accurately reflected the views and was dispatched to the proper receiving groups. Many correspondents were members of colonial legislative assemblies, and others were also active in the Sons of Liberty and Stamp Act Congress. A total of about 7,000 to 8,000 patriots served on these committees at the colonial and local levels, comprising most of the leadership in their communities. Loyalists were naturally excluded. The committees became the leaders of the American resistance to Great Britain and largely determined the war effort at the state and local level. When Congress decided to boycott British products, the colonial and local committees took charge, examining merchant records and publishing the names of merchants who attempted to defy the boycott. The committees promoted patriotism and home manufacturing, advising Americans to avoid luxuries and lead a more simple life. The committees gradually extended their power over many aspects of American public life. They set up espionage networks to identify disloyal elements, displaced royal officials, and helped diminish the influence of the British government in each of the colonies. In late 1774 and early 1775, they supervised the elections of provincial conventions, which began the operation of a true colonial government. Boston Tea Party, 1773. The Boston Tea Party was an American political and mercantile protest by the Sons of Liberty in Boston, Massachusetts, on December 16, 1773. The target was the Tea Act of May 10, 1773, which allowed the British East India Company to sell tea from China in American colonies without paying taxes apart from those imposed by the Townshend Acts. The Sons of Liberty strongly opposed the taxes in the Townshend Act as a violation of their rights. Protesters, some disguised as American Indians, destroyed an entire shipment of tea sent by the East India Company. The demonstrators boarded the ships and threw the chests of tea into the Boston harbor. The British government considered the protest an act of treason and responded harshly. The episode escalated into the American Revolution, becoming an iconic event of American history. Since then, other political protests, such as the Tea Party movement, have referred to themselves as historical successors to the Boston protest of 1773. The Tea Party was the culmination of a resistance movement throughout British America against the Tea Act, a tax passed by the British Parliament in 1773. Colonists objected to the Tea Act, believing it violated their rights as Englishmen to no taxation without representation. That is, to be taxed only by their own elected representatives and not by a parliament in which they were not represented. In addition, the well-connected East India Company had been granted competitive advantages over colonial tea importers, who resented the move and feared additional infringement on their business. Protesters had prevented the unloading of tea in 3 other colonies, but in Boston, embattled Royal Governor Thomas Hutchinson refused to allow the tea to be returned to Great Britain. The Boston Tea Party was a significant event in the growth of the American Revolution. Parliament responded in 1774 with the Intolerable Acts, or Coercive Acts, which, among other provisions, ended local self-government in Massachusetts and closed Boston's commerce. Colonists up and down the 13 colonies in turn responded to the Intolerable Acts with additional acts of protest, and by convening the First Continental Congress, which petitioned the British monarch for repeal of the acts and coordinated colonial resistance to them. The crisis escalated, and the American Revolutionary War began near Boston in 1775. Intolerable Acts, Coercive Acts, 1774. The Intolerable Acts were a series of punitive laws passed by the British Parliament in 1774 after the Boston Tea Party. The laws aimed to punish Massachusetts colonists for their defiance in the Tea Party protest of the Tea Act in Great Britain. These laws were referred to as the Coercive Acts. They were a key development leading to the outbreak of the American Revolutionary War in April 1775. 4 acts were enacted by Parliament in early 1774 in direct response to the Boston Tea Party of December 16, 1773. Boston Port, Massachusetts Government, Impartial Administration of Justice, and Quartering Acts. The acts took away self-governance and rights that Massachusetts had enjoyed since its founding, triggering outrage and indignation in the 13 colonies. The British Parliament hoped these punitive measures would, by making an example of Massachusetts, reverse the trend of colonial resistance to parliamentary authority that had begun with the 1764 Sugar Act. A 5th act, the Quebec Act, enlarged the boundaries of what was then the province of Quebec, notably southwestward into the Ohio country and other future Midwestern states, and instituted reforms generally favorable to the Francophone Catholic inhabitants of the region. Although unrelated to the other 4 acts, it was passed in the same legislative session and seen by the colonists as one of the intolerable acts. The Patriots viewed the acts as an arbitrary violation of the rights of Massachusetts, and in September 1774, they organized the First Continental Congress to coordinate a protest. As tensions escalated, the Revolutionary War broke out in April 1775, leading to the declaration of an independent United States of America in July 1776. First Continental Congress 1774. The First Continental Congress was a meeting of delegates from 12 of the 13 British colonies that became the United States. It met from September 5 to October 26, 1774, at Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, after the British Navy instituted a blockade of Boston Harbor and Parliament passed the punitive Intolerable Acts in response to the December 1773 Boston Tea Party. During the opening weeks of the Congress, the delegates conducted a spirited discussion about how the colonies could collectively respond to the British government's coercive actions, and they worked to make a common cause. As a prelude to its decisions, the Congress's first action was the adoption of the Suffolk Resolves, a measure drawn up by several counties in Massachusetts that included a declaration of grievances, called for a trade boycott of British goods, and urged each colony to set up and train its own militia. A less radical plan was then proposed to create a union of Great Britain and the colonies, but the delegates tabled the measure and later struck it from the record of their proceedings. They then agreed on a declaration and resolves that included the Continental Association, a proposal for an embargo on British trade. They also drew up a petition to the king pleading for redress of their grievances and repeal of the intolerable acts. That appeal had no effect, so the colonies convened the Second Continental Congress the following May, shortly after the battles of Lexington and Concord, to organize the defense of the colonies at the outset of the Revolutionary War. American Revolutionary War, 1775. Despite attempts to achieve a peaceful solution, fighting began after the Westminster Massacre in March, with the Battle of Lexington on April 19, 1775, and in June, Congress authorized the creation of a Continental Army with George Washington as commander-in-chief. Although the coercion policy advocated by the North Ministry was opposed by a faction within Parliament, both sides increasingly viewed conflict as inevitable. The Olive Branch petition sent by Congress to George III in July 1775 was rejected, and in August Parliament declared the colonies in a state of rebellion. Following the loss of Boston in March 1776, Sir William Howe, the new British commander-in-chief, launched the New York and New Jersey campaign. He captured New York City in November, before Washington won small but significant victories at Trenton and Princeton, which restored Patriot confidence. In summer 1777, Howe succeeded in taking Philadelphia, but in October a separate force under John Burgoyne was forced to surrender at Saratoga. This victory was crucial in convincing powers like France and Spain that an independent United States was a viable entity. The Continental Army then went into winter quarters in Valley Forge, where General von Steuben drilled it into an organized fighting unit. France provided the U.S. informal economic and military support from the beginning of the rebellion, and after Saratoga, the two countries signed a commercial agreement and a treaty of alliance in February 1778. In return for a guarantee of independence, Congress joined France in its global war with Britain and agreed to defend the French West Indies. Spain also allied with France against Britain in the Treaty of Aranjuez, 1779. Though it did not formally ally with the Americans. Nevertheless, access to ports in Spanish Louisiana allowed the Patriots to import arms and supplies, while the Spanish Gulf Coast campaign deprived the Royal Navy of key bases in the South. This undermined the 1778 strategy devised by Howe's replacement, Sir Henry Clinton, which took the war into the southern United States. Despite some initial success, by September 1781, Cornwallis was besieged by a Franco-American force in Yorktown. After an attempt to resupply the garrison failed, Cornwallis surrendered in October. Although the British wars with France and Spain continued for another 2 years, Britain's forces in America were generally confined to several harbors and western forts, while fighting in North America largely ceased. In April 1782, the North Ministry was replaced by a new British government, which accepted American independence and began negotiating the Treaty of Paris. With the treaty's ratification on September 3, 1783, Britain accepted American independence, and the war officially ended. The treaties of Versailles resolved separate conflicts with France and Spain. Lee Resolution, July 2, 1776. The Lee Resolution, also known as the Resolution for Independence, was the formal assertion passed by the Second Continental Congress on July 2, 1776, which resolved that the 13 colonies in America, at the time referred to as United Colonies, were free and independent states, separated from the British Empire, and creating what became the United States of America, USA. News of this act was published that evening in the Pennsylvania Evening Post and the next day in the Pennsylvania Gazette. The Declaration of Independence is the formal document which officially announced and explained the resolution, approved 2 days later on July 4, 1776. The resolution is named for Richard Henry Lee of Virginia, who proposed it to Congress after receiving instructions and wording from the 5th Virginia Convention and its president, Edmund Pendleton. Lee's full resolution had 3 parts, which were considered by Congress on June 7, 1776. Along with the independence issue, it also proposed to establish a plan for ensuing American foreign relations and to prepare a plan of a confederation for the states to consider. Congress decided to address each of these three parts separately. Some sources indicate that Lee used the language from the Virginia Convention's instructions almost verbatim. Voting was delayed for several weeks on the first part of the resolution, while state support and legislative instruction for independence were consolidated, but the press of events forced the other, less discussed parts to proceed immediately. On June 10th, Congress decided to form a committee to draft a Declaration of Independence in case the resolution should pass. The following day, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert R. Livingston were appointed as the Committee of Five to accomplish this. That same day, Congress decided to establish two other committees to develop the resolution's last two parts. The following day, another Committee of Five, John Dickinson, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Benjamin Harrison V, and Robert Morris, was established to prepare a plan of treaties to be proposed to foreign powers. A third committee was created, consisting of one member from each colony, to prepare a draft of a constitution for confederation of the states. The committee appointed to prepare a plan of treaties made its first report on July 18th, largely in the writing of John Adams. A limited printing of the document was authorized, and it was reviewed and amended by Congress over the next 5 weeks. On August 27, the amended plan of treaties was referred back to the committee to develop instructions concerning the amendments, and Richard Henry Lee and James Wilson were added to the committee. 2 days later, the committee was empowered to prepare further instructions and report back to Congress. The formal version of the plan of treaties was adopted on September 17th. On September 24th, Congress approved negotiating instructions for commissioners to obtain a treaty with France, based on the template provided in the plan of treaties. The next day, Benjamin Franklin, Silas Deane, and Thomas Jefferson were elected commissioners to the court of France. Alliance with France was considered vital if the war with Britain was to be won and the newly declared country was to survive. The committee drafting a plan of confederation was chaired by John Dickinson. They presented their initial results to Congress on July 12, 1776. Long debates followed on such issues as sovereignty, the exact powers to be given the Confederate government, whether to have a judiciary, and voting procedures. The final draft of the Articles of Confederation was prepared during the summer of 1777 and approved by Congress for ratification by the individual states on November 15, 1777, after a year of debate. It continued in use from that time onward, although it was not ratified by all states until almost 4 years later, on March 1st, 1781. Here's a review of the major historical episodes in our early American history. French and Indian War, 1754-1763. The Royal Proclamation Line of 1763. Pontiac's Rebellion, 1763. The Sugar Act and Stamp, 1764-1765. Declaratory Act, 1766. Townshend Acts, 1767-1768. Boston Massacre, 1770. Committees of Correspondence, 1772. Boston Tea Party, 1773. Intolerable Acts, Coercive Acts, 1774. First Continental Congress, 1774. American Revolutionary War, 1775. Lee Resolution, July 2, 1776. Summary. Between 1750 and 1776, tensions between the American colonies and the British Crown steadily escalated due to economic and political pressures. After the 7 Years' War, 1756-1763, known in North America as the French and Indian War, Britain was in a deep recession and heavily in debt. To recover financially, Parliament imposed a series of tax acts on the colonies, such as the Stamp Act, 1765, and the Townshend Acts, 1767. These taxes were not just about revenue, they were also a way for King George III to assert control at a time when he appeared weak in England, fearing a fate similar to Charles I. In addition to taxation, Britain stationed a large military force in the colonies after the war. Officially, the troops were meant to protect the frontier, but their real purpose was to enforce tax collection. However, the widespread armament of the colonists made coercion difficult. As resistance grew, including acts of defiance like the Boston Tea Party, 1773, the king escalated his response. He eventually ordered a massive deployment of troops and naval forces to disarm the colonies, aiming to enforce taxation through force while simultaneously reinforcing his power in Britain and maintaining employment for his expanded army. This power struggle culminated on April 19, 1775, at Concord, Massachusetts, when British troops marched to seize a large cache of colonial arms. The resulting armed resistance marked the first battle of the American Revolution, setting the colonies on the irreversible path to independence. That concludes the 7th class in this series on American history from 1750 to 1776. I hope you found this information helpful and entertaining. I will see you in Class 8, where we will go over Patrick Henry's speech, "Give me liberty or give me death." Fall out